Welcome to a journey through one of the most chilling and bizarre cases ever documented in American history. This is the story of a man who served his community in their darkest hours, yet harbored a secret so disturbing it would forever stain the memory of a tranquil New England town. The town of Hallowdale, nestled deep in the serene Echo Canyon Valley of New Hampshire, was by all accounts a picture of small-town Americana in the early 20th century. With a population of just under 1,500 souls, it was a place where everyone knew their neighbors, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons and the tolling of the church bells on Sunday mornings. Here, death was a solemn, though occasional visitor. The community was tight-knit, built on trust and shared traditions. Most residents were involved in agriculture or local commerce, with a few commuting to larger towns via the newly laid Granite Valley Railroad. The central hub was a bustling public square, featuring a majestic stone fountain built in 1888, commemorating the town's founding. Surrounding the square were the pillars of community life, the Hallowdale Savings Bank, the local post office, and a variety of small shops. 2 blocks from the square on Pine Avenue stood the Sterling and Sons Funeral Home, a dignified gray stone building with striking stained glass windows and a simple brass plaque displaying the family name. For generations, the Sterling family had been the town's trusted caretakers for the dead, guiding bereaved families through the difficult process of saying goodbye. They were known for their meticulous attention to detail and their compassionate professional demeanor. This role, in a time when families were transitioning from home-based funeral rites to professional services, placed an immense amount of faith in the undertakers. It was a trust that, for the most part, was honored with the utmost integrity. The business had been founded in 1870 by Barnaby Sterling, a man who had honed his skills as a military embalmer during the Civil War. His expertise in preservation techniques and his respectful approach to his work established the profession as an essential service. Upon his death in 1895, the business passed to his son, Harrison Sterling, who maintained the firm's reputation for dignity and care. Harrison was a beloved figure in Hallowdale, a man known for his kindness and his active involvement in community affairs. His own funeral in 1908 was attended by hundreds of Hallowdale residents, a testament to the high regard in which he was held. By 1912, the reins of the business had passed to Julian Sterling, Harrison's son. In his early 40s, Julian was a stark contrast to his amiable father. According to local records, Julian had left Hallowdale after graduating in 1890 to pursue a degree in anatomy at a university in Boston. He had returned abruptly in 1905, just before his father's health began to decline, without completing his studies. This unexplained return and his peculiar, reclusive nature would later be viewed as significant by those who sought to understand his psychological profile. Julian was described by townspeople as a serious, solitary figure. He was tall, with thinning dark hair and a meticulously groomed mustache, presenting the precise and formal appearance expected of his profession. His daily routine was predictable and rigid. He would rise early, take breakfast alone at the Hallowdale Inn, and then retreat to the funeral home to handle administrative tasks or prepare for a service. He was neither liked nor disliked, instead existing on the periphery of Hallowdale society, respected for the necessary service he provided, but rarely invited into social circles. Those who did business with him, such as the local florist or the printer who produced memorial cards, described him as unfailingly precise and generous with his payments, though he lacked the warmth that had characterized his father's business relationships. He was exact about everything, recalled Mr. Fitzwilliam, the town printer, in a later statement. Every memorial card had to be perfect, from the paper to the typeface. He would pay promptly, sometimes extra, but he never smiled. He never engaged in casual conversation. It was as if social pleasantries were a foreign language to him. The Sterling Funeral Home earned a unique reputation for the lifelike appearance of the deceased at viewings. Mourners often commented that their loved ones looked peaceful, almost as if they were simply sleeping, and they attributed this to Julian's exceptional skill. But what they couldn't have known was that Julian Sterling's attention to the bodies in his care went far beyond professional obligation. The funeral home itself was a testament to classic New England architecture, with its high ceilings, dark mahogany paneling, and heavy drapes that seemed to absorb both light and sound. The ground floor contained all the public spaces, a formal entry hall, a consultation room where Julian met with grieving families, and two viewing rooms of different sizes. These public areas were maintained in immaculate condition, with polished wood, carefully chosen furnishings, and subdued lighting. The second floor was Julian's private residence. These rooms were never seen by clients or casual visitors. Even his cleaning lady, Grace Miller, was only permitted to enter once a week for basic tidying and never without his direct supervision. The basement of the funeral home, where the preparation work took place, was a world unto itself. It was accessible via a narrow staircase at the rear of the building, and few Hallowdale residents had ever ventured into this private, professional territory. Those who had, delivery men, or the occasional young apprentice who never seemed to last long, described a clinically clean environment with tiled walls and floors, specialized tables, and cabinets filled with the tools of the mortician's trade. The basement extended beneath the entire building, though visitors were only ever shown the main preparation room. The rest was ostensibly used for storing caskets and embalming chemicals. But upon closer inspection, anyone would have noticed the unusual amount of storage space, cabinets and closets that seemed far too numerous for the practical needs of a small-town funeral home. Had anyone examined the original building plans, they might have noticed significant alterations made by Julian in 1910, creating spaces that were not reflected in any official documentation. The first hint that something was amiss came in the spring of 1915, with the death of Margaret Collins, a young widow of 26. Margaret had died suddenly of pneumonia, her death particularly tragic as her husband had passed away just a year earlier. Her sister, Beth Thorpe, traveled from Boston to handle the arrangements at the Sterling Funeral Home. Later, in a statement to investigators, Beth recalled being deeply disturbed by Julian Sterling's manner. He spoke of Margaret's exceptional beauty with an inappropriate familiarity. Beth noted that he described her as the most perfect subject he had received in months, a phrase that struck her as both clinical and disturbingly personal. He even asked if she would prefer Margaret to be dressed in her wedding gown, a suggestion that caught Beth off guard as she had never mentioned it. This realization only came to her later, after everything else had been exposed. The funeral proceeded as planned, but the uneasy feeling lingered with Beth long after she returned home. The funeral home itself was a magnificent example of Victorian-era architecture, with its soaring ceilings, dark mahogany paneling, and heavy drapes that seemed to trap the silence within its walls. The building, constructed in 1870, served as both a place of business and a family residence. The ground floor housed the professional spaces, a formal entry hall with a guest book, a quiet consultation room, two viewing parlors of different sizes, and a small chapel for private services. These public areas were kept in flawless condition, with polished wood and carefully arranged furniture, all bathed in the soft, somber glow of brass sconces. A large oil painting of Barnaby Sterling, the firm's founder, hung sternly in the consultation room, overseeing every transaction. Julian Sterling's private quarters were on the second floor, a space never seen by clients. These rooms, a bedroom, a sitting room, a study, were off limits to everyone except his cleaning lady, Grace Miller, who was only allowed in once a week. The third floor, once servants' quarters, was completely unused, a testament to Julian's solitary nature. But the most private and guarded space in the entire building was the basement. The basement, where all the preparation work took place, was a world few ever saw. It was accessible only by a narrow staircase at the back of the building, and few Hallowdale residents had ever ventured into this private, professional territory. Those who had, delivery men or the young apprentices who never seemed to stay long, described it as a sterile, clinical environment. It had tiled walls and floors, specialized embalming tables, and cabinets full of a mortician's tools. The basement extended beneath the entire building, though visitors were only ever shown the main preparation room. The rest was supposedly for storage of caskets and chemicals. However, a keen eye might have noticed the unusual amount of storage space, cabinets and closets that seemed far too numerous for the practical needs of a small-town funeral home. Had anyone checked the building plans filed with the county clerk, they would have found discrepancies. Julian had commissioned significant renovations in 1910, supposedly to modernize the facility. These alterations had completely changed the basement layout, creating spaces that were not on any official record. The contractor who performed the work, a man named Marcus Green, later stated to police that Julian had been unusually specific about the renovations, insisting on absolute privacy and refusing to let workers enter certain areas once basic construction was complete. He was meticulous about everything, Green recalled. The lighting had to be positioned just so, with multiple angles possible. He asked for special mirrors that could be moved around the room. I assume these were for the embalming process to make sure the deceased looked proper from every angle. Green's testimony, given in July 1915, also mentioned that Julian had requested unusually complex locks for certain basement doors, locks that seemed excessive for a small-town business. He said it was to protect his specialized equipment and chemicals, Green told the police. I thought nothing of it at the time, but looking back, his insistence on personally overseeing the installation of those locks seems significant. Most troubling in retrospect, Green noted, was Julian's request for a separate room, accessible only through the main preparation area, with no windows or external entrance. He called it his special projects room and said it was for experimental preservation techniques, Green stated. He was quite animated about it, more than I'd ever seen him. He said it would allow him to advance his professional methods beyond what his father had practiced. At the time, it seemed like admirable professional dedication. The first major hint that something was profoundly wrong came not from a family member, but from a subtle observation by a community outsider. In the late spring of 1915, the body of Eleanor Vance, a young schoolteacher of 28, was brought to the funeral home. Eleanor had been well known and liked for her gentle spirit and her devotion to her students. She had died of a sudden, severe illness. The funeral was a major event in Hallowdale, attended by nearly everyone in town. The local florist, Mr. Abernathy, delivered the flowers for the service. He had worked with the Sterling family for decades and had known Julian since he was a boy. As he was setting up the arrangements, he noticed Julian speaking to Eleanor's body in a strange, soft tone. When Abernathy politely asked a question about the flowers, Julian seemed startled and quickly changed his demeanor, becoming cold and professional once more. This struck Abernathy as odd, but he dismissed it as Julian's peculiar ways. A week later, Mr. Abernathy was speaking to a traveling salesman who had also done business with Julian. The salesman mentioned that Julian had requested an unusual order of cosmetic powders and rouges, far more than a typical funeral home would need, and in shades more suited for a living person than a corpse. This was a passing detail, but it stuck in Abernathy's mind. The pieces began to fit together a little more with the death of Captain Thomas Reed, a beloved war veteran in his 70s. Julian prepared his body for burial, but his private logbook, which would later be discovered, contained a disturbing entry for Captain Reed. Subject unsuitable for extended preparation. Minimal work performed. Physical condition precludes interest beyond professional requirements. This pattern of Julian, categorizing the deceased as suitable or unsuitable for his extended preparation, was a recurring theme in his secret records, a classification based entirely on his own morbid aesthetic criteria rather than any professional consideration. In the late summer of that year, the body of Lily Cooper, the 18-year-old daughter of the town's beloved schoolmaster, Thomas Cooper, was brought to Julian. Lily had drowned in a tragic swimming accident. Her father, a widower who had raised her alone, was inconsolable. He requested a delayed funeral to allow relatives to travel from out of state, leaving Lily's body in Julian's care for 5 days. During this time, Thomas Cooper visited the funeral home every day, spending hours at his daughter's side. He put his complete trust in Julian, believing he was providing the best possible care for Lily. The peaceful facade of Hallowdale was shattered in July 1915. Thomas Cooper, the schoolmaster, returned to the Sterling funeral home late one evening. He had found an old photograph of his daughter Lily that he wanted to add to her memorial display. He knew the home would be closed, but he saw a light on in the basement and hoped Julian might be working late. His statement to the police, filed on July 10, 1915, would forever be a part of the county's dark history. It was just after 9:30 p.m., his statement read. I knocked at the front door but received no answer. Thinking Mr. Sterling might not have heard me, I tried the door and found it unlocked. I called out, but there was no response. I thought perhaps he was in the basement preparing my daughter for the funeral, and I could just leave the photograph with him. What Thomas Cooper discovered upon descending the narrow staircase would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard strange, low humming sounds coming from the preparation room. Worried that something might be wrong, he quietly pushed the door ajar and peered through the narrow opening. The scene he witnessed was a nightmare. Julian Sterling was not performing any professional duties. He was seated beside Lily's body, which was arranged on the embalming table, in a manner that suggested a deeply disturbing intimacy. Julian was allegedly speaking to the deceased, stroking her hair and face as if she were still alive. The police report, later redacted from public records due to the graphic nature of the details, documented that Julian was engaged in behaviors far more disturbing than merely talking to a corpse. These details, deemed too shocking even for the standards of early 20th century law enforcement, suggested a level of physical interaction with the deceased that violated every professional and moral code. Overcome with horror and rage, Thomas Cooper cried out, causing Julian to look up with an expression not of shame or surprise, but of irritation at being interrupted. Mr. Cooper fled the funeral home and went directly to Chief Donnelly's house. The chief, initially skeptical, attributed Cooper's distress to grief. Mr. Cooper was in a highly agitated state, Donnelly wrote in his report. His description seemed to be influenced by the extreme distress any father would feel. Nevertheless, Donnelly agreed to accompany Cooper back to the funeral home to investigate. They found Julian Sterling in the main viewing room, calmly arranging flowers. When confronted, Julian denied all allegations, claiming he was simply making final adjustments to ensure the young lady looked her best. His remarkably composed demeanor made Cooper's accusations seem almost hysterical by comparison. Uncertain of how to proceed, but disturbed by Cooper's obvious trauma, Chief Donnelly ordered that Lily's body be removed from Julian's care and transferred to a funeral home in the neighboring town of Concord. There, the undertaker, Morris Whitfield, noted in his records that the deceased appears to have been subjected to unusual cosmetic attention. Whitfield also documented fresh bruises on her wrists and ankles, which he photographed as evidence before completing the preparation for burial. The incident might have ended there, but for the courage of Grace Miller, Julian's cleaning lady. Having heard rumors of the disturbance, she approached Chief Donnelly with her own suspicions that had festered over the years. Miller, a widow in her 60s, had long dismissed Julian's oddities, but now they took on a horrifying new meaning. According to police records, Miller reported finding unusual items in the waste bins. Excessive amounts of makeup, personal grooming tools, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be locks of hair carefully tied with ribbons. She also described a secret drawer in Julian's desk that contained a collection of bizarre mementos. On July 12, 1915, Chief Donnelly obtained a warrant and, with two other officers, conducted a thorough search of the Sterling funeral home. The search began in the public areas, where nothing seemed out of place. It then moved to Julian's private quarters and finally to the basement. What they discovered would shock the community and forever brand Julian Sterling as one of the most disturbed criminals in Dutchess County history. The search uncovered a carefully cataloged collection of items taken from the deceased, but the most horrifying find was in a hidden room, accessible through a concealed door behind a large cabinet in the main preparation area. The room, which Julian had called his special projects room, contained a second embalming table, special lighting, and a camera on a tripod. Most disturbingly, they found locked cabinets containing albums of photographs. These images, taken in the hidden room, documented Julian's interactions with the deceased in various stages of preparation. The photographs were meticulously organized, labeled with names and dates, and annotated with personal comments. The collection dated back to 1909, suggesting his activities had been ongoing for at least 6 years. The photographs, described in police reports as unsuitable for public documentation, depicted Julian posing with the deceased in ways that ranged from inappropriate to explicitly violating. He had arranged bodies in lifelike poses, seated at a table or reclined on a sofa. In others, he had documented himself engaged in acts that, even by the standards of 1915, were recognized as profoundly disturbed and criminal. In addition to the photographs, investigators discovered Julian's journals. Excerpts included in the police file but later sealed by court order reportedly contained explicit descriptions of his activities. He spoke of his work with a chilling detachment, as if he were an artist and the deceased were his subjects. He expressed his belief that he was preserving a beauty that would otherwise be lost to decay. One book on anatomy contained extensive notes in Julian's handwriting, with passages highlighted and annotated with his thoughts on techniques for preserving and enhancing the human body after death. Julian Sterling was arrested on July 12, 1915, and charged with multiple counts of violating a corpse. The news of his arrest spread through Hallowdale like a firestorm. The local newspaper, the Hallowdale Chronicle, ran a front-page story with a sensational headline: "Funeral Director Arrested for Shocking Misconduct." To protect the families involved and maintain some semblance of decorum, the paper refrained from publishing the explicit details. The article stated that Julian had been taken into custody following an investigation into improper conduct in the exercise of his professional duties. The local community's reaction was a complex mix of disbelief and horror. For many, it was impossible to reconcile the composed, professional undertaker they had known with the disturbed individual described in hushed conversations. Some residents felt a pang of guilt, wondering if they had missed any signs of his deviance, while others insisted there had been no signs at all, that Julian had maintained his professional facade with remarkable skill. For the families who had entrusted their loved ones to his care, the revelation brought a unique and profound form of trauma. They faced not only the horror of what might have happened to their deceased relatives, but also the impossible decision of whether to seek confirmation through exhumation or to live with the agonizing uncertainty. Most chose the latter, preferring to leave the terrible truth buried, literally and figuratively. The Hallowdale clergy tried to provide comfort and guidance during this difficult time. Reverend Michael Donovan of the All Saints Chapel, where Julian had occasionally attended services, addressed the case in his Sunday sermon. He spoke of the darkness that can exist within any human heart and urged his congregation to find strength and compassion for the victims. "We gather today in the shadow of a betrayal of trust so profound," he preached, "that it challenges our very understanding of human nature. Let us remember that the acts of one individual do not define our community. In responding to this darkness with compassion for those affected, we affirm the goodness that still prevails among us." When questioned by authorities, Julian Sterling offered no defense. According to police records, he remained unnervingly calm, speaking of his actions with a disturbing detachment, as if they were ordinary business practices. He expressed genuine confusion, not about being arrested, but about the reaction to what he called his appreciation of beauty preserved beyond life. He told investigators that he had always felt a connection to those between worlds, but had only begun to act on these feelings after his father's death in 1908 when he took over the business. Julian's brief time in jail was marked by the same eerie composure. He spoke little to other inmates or guards, instead spending most of his time writing in a notebook provided by his attorney. The contents of these writings, if they still exist, remain sealed, a final part of his disturbing legacy. The attending physician noted that Julian showed no signs of recognized mental illness as it was understood in 1915. No hallucinations, no delusions. By all clinical standards of the time, he was sane, a fact that made his behavior even more disturbing. The case never went to trial. On July 25, 1915, Julian Sterling was found dead in his cell. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as suicide by ingesting embalming fluid, which he had apparently smuggled into the jail concealed in a toiletry bottle. A subsequent investigation found that his own attorney had unknowingly delivered the package, having been given it by Julian's out-of-town cousin, who claimed it contained personal items Julian had requested. No charges were filed against the cousin or the attorney, as investigators were satisfied that neither had knowingly helped Julian commit suicide. Julian's final note, written on 3 pages, contained no apology or explanation. Instead, it was a long, rambling complaint that his work had been misunderstood. He wrote that he had provided a service to the deceased and their families by preserving a beauty that would otherwise be lost to decay. The note revealed a profound detachment from normal ethical and moral boundaries. "I have done nothing but honor those who have passed," he wrote. "I have preserved them, appreciated them, kept them company when all others have abandoned them to the earth. Is this not a greater service than the hasty, impersonal preparation most undertakers provide?" The final paragraph was even more chilling. "Those who judge me understand neither death nor beauty. In my care, the deceased achieved a perfection denied them in life. They became art, preserved in moments of ideal form, appreciated as they deserve to be. What I have done is not a crime, but a devotion. Not a violation, but a consecration. If society cannot understand this, then I choose to join those I have honored in the realm where such understanding is unnecessary." With Julian's suicide, the possibility of a complete investigation or prosecution vanished. The total number of victims remained unknown. The community, denied the catharsis of a public trial, was left to deal with the trauma without closure. Authorities faced the delicate task of notifying families whose deceased loved ones appeared in Julian's records or photographs. This was done with extreme discretion, and many details were withheld to spare families unnecessary distress. With Julian Sterling's suicide, the possibility of a complete investigation or public trial vanished. Questions about the total number of victims, whether his behavior had been suspected before, and if he had engaged in similar acts in Boston, would remain largely unanswered. The community, denied the catharsis of a public judgment, was left to process the horror without any sense of closure. Authorities now face the delicate and agonizing task of notifying the families of the deceased who appeared in Julian's records or photographs. This process was handled with extreme discretion, with many details withheld to spare the families from further, unimaginable distress. According to later county records, at least 30 families were directly contacted regarding evidence that their loved ones had been among Julian's victims. The actual number was likely far higher, as investigators chose not to contact families where the evidence was less conclusive or the violations appeared to have been less severe. The county made the difficult decision to seal most records related to the case, accessible only to law enforcement and by a special court order. This decision, while intended to protect the dignity of the deceased and the feelings of their families, had the unintended consequence of allowing the full details of the case to gradually become forgotten or distorted over time. Without accessible records, the Sterling case would eventually become more of a local ghost story than a documented historical event in Hallowdale's collective memory. The Sterling and Sons funeral home was permanently closed. The building remained vacant for several years, becoming the subject of local whispered rumors, before being purchased in 1920 by a hardware merchant who had it completely demolished. A new, unremarkable structure was built in its place. No trace of the original building remains today. Its physical history was erased, but its psychological stain on the town was indelible. The impact of the Julian Sterling case extended far beyond Hallowdale. News of the shocking misconduct, though reported with limited vague details, reached funeral directors and regulatory bodies throughout the Northeast. According to records from the New England Funeral Directors Association, the case sparked intense discussions about the need for increased oversight and standardization of funeral practices. While formal regulations would not be implemented for several more years, the Sterling case became a powerful cautionary tale cited in professional circles. In a 1917 address to the National Funeral Directors Association, the president of the association made an indirect but clear reference to the case. He spoke of the sacred trust placed in the hands of funeral professionals by grieving families and stressed the need for the profession to be governed by the highest ethical standards. To this end, he said, I propose the formation of a committee to draft comprehensive guidelines for our profession, addressing not only the scientific aspects of our work, but also the moral obligations inherent in our calling. The Sterling case, therefore, served as a catalyst for significant and necessary changes in the funeral industry, contributing to the safeguards and professional standards that are in place today. The full extent of Julian Sterling's activities may never be known. The sealed records in the county archives contain the grim details, the photographs that are too inappropriate to be viewed, and the journal entries too troubling to be quoted. The story of Julian Sterling and the Hallowdale Funeral Home is a deeply unsettling one. It presents a disturbing intersection of professional authority, private deviance, and a community's blind trust. It reminds us that history contains dark corners that resist comfortable examination, episodes that challenge our understanding of human behavior and leave us with more questions than answers. While modern safeguards make it highly unlikely that such a case could unfold in the same way today, the Sterling case stands as a testament to the importance of those safeguards and to the necessity of vigilance, even in matters we would prefer not to contemplate. For the families affected, those who learned the terrible truth and those who were mercifully spared that knowledge, the legacy of Julian Sterling was a private horror that few felt comfortable discussing openly. Community records from the years following the case show a distinct shift. Hallowdale residents increasingly chose to transport their deceased loved ones to funeral homes in neighboring communities rather than patronize the new establishment that eventually opened in town. This pattern persisted for nearly a generation before gradually subsiding. In 1967, the last known direct connection to the Sterling case ended with the death of Beth Thorpe, the sister of Margaret Collins, one of Julian's victims. In an interview conducted shortly before her death as part of a local historical society project, Beth refused to discuss the specifics of what had happened to her sister, saying only, "Some truths serve no purpose but to cause pain. What's done is done." The interviewer, sensing her profound discomfort, did not press for details. And so, the case of Julian Sterling, the Undertaker of Hallowdale, has largely receded from public consciousness. It remains documented but mostly unexamined, remembered but rarely discussed. A dark chapter in local history that few care to revisit. The residents of modern Hallowdale go about their lives largely unaware of what once occurred in their peaceful community. The sealed records in the county archives ensure that the most disturbing details remain confined to the past. The story of Julian Sterling is not one of a supernatural horror or extraordinary evil. It is instead a grim tale of ordinary deviance concealed behind a respected professional role. A betrayal of trust made possible by privacy, authority, and the reluctance of a community to imagine that such violations could occur in their midst. It reminds us that sometimes the most troubling dangers are not those that announce themselves with violence or spectacle, but those that operate quietly behind closed doors, exploiting the trust we place in those who serve essential social functions. It is a historical footnote that helped to shape modern funeral practices, contributing to changes that now make similar cases far less likely to occur or to continue undetected. In the end, what Julian Sterling did was not an act of devotion, but of profound disrespect and violation. His victims, now resting peacefully in the cemeteries across the county, had their final dignity restored by time, silence, and the merciful fading of memory. I hope you found this rewritten story to be a compelling and respectful retelling of a dark piece of history. If you're interested in more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Your engagement helps us bring more untold histories to light. Thank you for listening.